Hi there, welcome back to HauntingVeils. Today we're going to talk about The Crimson Teacup, a Hercule Poirot mystery. It was meant to be a quiet afternoon, an elegant garden party, polished silver, and the family's sacred tradition. Tea served in a crimson cup. But when one sip ends in death, the illusion shatters. Secrets surface, and beneath the charm of Willowmere Hall, something far more sinister begins to unfold. Only Hercule Poirot can trace the poison back to its source. Stay with us until the end to uncover every twist behind this chilling mystery. Chapter 1. The Garden Party. The sky stretched wide and clear above Kent, a flawless canopy of blue interrupted only by the occasional drift of lazy clouds, as if the very heavens had been commissioned by Lady Evelyn Marshwood herself. Willowmere Hall was a jewel of English aristocracy, an estate soaked in legacy and trimmed with perfection, centuries-old oaks casting dappled shade across gravel paths, bronze statues standing sentinel beside flowering hedges, and the grand façade of the manor rising in stately dominance beyond the manicured lawns. The annual Marshwood Garden Party was no mere social event. It was an institution, a ceremonial parade of prestige where only the most polished, powerful, or intriguing were invited. An invitation meant you had arrived or that you were being closely watched. That year's party was especially anticipated, not for the roses in bloom or the debut of Lady Evelyn's niece's latest gallery venture, but because Hercule Poirot, the famed Belgian detective of international renown, had accepted the invitation. Not out of social obligation, mind you, but because Lady Evelyn had sent him a private note in her unmistakable script, which read simply, "Come for tea, Monsieur Poirot, and watch the cup." It may tip more than just balance. It was the kind of message Poirot found impossible to ignore. The garden buzzed with light conversation and the clinking of fine china. Women in pastel silks glided between white marquees. Men in tailored waistcoats stood in polite clusters sipping elderflower cocktails, and beneath the cooling shade of a vast willow tree, an ensemble played Bach with effortless grace. At the center of it all, perched like a queen bee among bees, was Lady Evelyn herself, tall and silver-haired, with a face carved in aristocratic resolve. In her hand, she held the famed crimson teacup, a relic of the Marshwood lineage, crafted from fine porcelain in 1824 and rimmed with real gold, its deep crimson swirls glistening like dried blood beneath the sun. The crimson teacup was only ever used on the day of the garden party and only ever served to the guest of honor, a silent crown passed by hand. Today, that guest was Sir Hugo Barrett, a retired naval commander with a fondness for brandy, insults, and investments. He had recently poured a significant sum into a modern art gallery spearheaded by Lady Evelyn's niece, Beatrice, a venture which had raised more than a few noble eyebrows. Sir Hugo sat smugly beside Lady Evelyn, thumping his cane on the stone tiles for attention when needed, and charming the ladies with rehearsed war stories when not. Seated quietly at the edge of the garden's primary circle was Hercule Poirot, alone at a small table set deliberately apart from the rest, his eyes sweeping slowly across the gathering like a lighthouse beam. To the casual observer, he seemed merely contemplative, admiring the symmetry of the hydrangeas or the precision of the waitstaff. But to those who knew him or feared him, his stillness was deceptive. Poirot was not observing the garden. He was reading it. Every placement, every movement, every cup of tea passed from tray to hand. He noticed how Elise, the French maid, hesitated as she approached Sir Hugo's table with the tray of cups. He watched how Lady Evelyn's eyes lingered a moment too, long on the crimson teacup before giving a subtle nod. He noticed how Beatrice, seated 2 places to the left of Sir Hugo, gripped her own cup with white-knuckled tension, and how George Wexley, Hugo's solicitor, adjusted his cufflinks 3 times in the span of 2 minutes. Poirot didn't know yet what it all meant, but he filed each gesture away with the meticulous order of a chess player noting the opening gambit. Then it happened. A cough, dry, sudden, and then the unmistakable sound of porcelain shattering. Sir Hugo slumped sideways, his cup falling from his hand, crashing to the stone path in pieces. The reaction was instant and surreal. Gasps, screams, the ensemble ceasing mid-note, and Lady Evelyn standing so abruptly her chair scraped across the ground. Sir Hugo convulsed, his face turning an unnatural shade of blue, his mouth opening and closing without sound. A single gurgle escaped his throat, and then nothing. He collapsed against the armrest of his chair, a lifeless monument of what had been a living man just seconds earlier. The crowd froze. A woman fainted. A waiter dropped his tray. Lady Agatha Winthrop, Hugo's longtime companion, or adversary, depending on the day, stared blankly at the body, her hand trembling against her pearl necklace. Lady Evelyn remained silent, her fingers still wrapped around the crimson teacup, untouched. Poirot stood calmly, brushing down his waistcoat, and walked with measured steps toward the body. He crouched beside Sir Hugo, eyes narrowed, nostrils flaring slightly as he caught a faint, bitter scent rising from the cup's remnants. Almond, not the sweet variety used in cakes, but the pungent trace of cyanide, unmistakable and deadly. He looked up and surveyed the faces staring at him, pale, curious, terrified. The game, he realized, had already begun. Within the hour, a local constable named Fairbanks had arrived, clearly overwhelmed by the grandeur of the estate and the high society tension pressing in from all sides. Lady Evelyn, ever the composed hostess, took control of the scene with remarkable grace, ensuring guests were kept in the drawing room, statements were taken, and no one left the premises. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, as they stepped into her private study later that evening, "this is an abomination. In my garden, at my party." Poirot inclined his head solemnly. "Murder, madam, is always an abomination. But here, yes, it is also personal." He began interviews that very evening. Lady Agatha, despite claiming a deep affection for Sir Hugo, admitted their relationship had cooled over financial disagreements. "He threatened to withdraw his support for my wildlife foundation," she snapped, "because I wouldn't marry him. At 72. Imagine." George Wexley, the solicitor, was visibly shaken and hinted that Sir Hugo had recently altered his will, cutting out distant cousins in favor of Beatrice and, more controversially, Lady Evelyn herself. "He said family was loyalty," Wexley muttered, "and loyalty should be rewarded." Elise, the French maid, provided the most curious statement of all. She claimed to have seen someone leaning over the tea tray before it was served, but when pressed for details, she faltered. "I do not wish to accuse wrongly, monsieur. I only saw the back. Tall, perhaps a man, perhaps not." Poirot pressed gently, but the girl remained unsure. Poirot then requested to examine the crimson teacup. Lady Evelyn led him to the sitting room, where it sat upon its usual cushion of violet velvet, gleaming under lamplight. It had not been washed. Poirot lifted it delicately, noting a faint residue of elderflower, an infusion not present in the regular party tea, which had all been a strong Earl Grey blend. A substitution? A personal preference? Or a deliberate disguise? "Who prepared the tea?" Poirot asked. "Beatrice's cook, I believe. But Elise served it," Evelyn replied. Poirot examined the tray used to carry the cups. The arrangement had been precise. 6 cups, 1 central, the crimson, positioned like a crown. It was meant to honor him, Evelyn admitted. "He invested in Beatrice's gallery. I thought it only proper he be served accordingly." Poirot nodded. And yet, what was meant as a gesture became a signal. That night, Poirot wandered the estate alone. Willowmere Hall, under moonlight, seemed quieter, more ancient, less a home, more a vessel of secrets. Near the gazebo, Tucked behind a hedge, he found another teacup, unwashed and still half full. A servant must have forgotten it. He lifted it and sniffed. Burnt sugar, not almond. Possibly a decoy? Or something left intentionally to confuse. The next morning, Poirot returned to the drawing room where he had asked all guests to remain. They were tired now, less frightened and more restless. He watched them argue, whisper, and cast subtle glances. Everyone had something to hide, but only one had hidden poison in a teacup. Poirot smiled slightly to himself. The truth, he muttered in French, always steeps eventually. Chapter 2, 6 Cups. One poison. The morning after the murder unfolded like a grim ballet of grief and suspicion within Willowmere Hall. The sun, which had bathed the estate in golden warmth the previous day, now filtered in cold and pale through the high arched windows, as if it too mourned the loss or recoiled at the act. Breakfast was served in the morning room, but hardly touched. Plates were shuffled, tea left to cool in porcelain cups, and conversation flickered only in cautious glances. The guests had been instructed not to leave the premises, and despite their polished poise, Poirot could detect the restlessness in their posture, the way fingers tapped arms of chairs, how napkins were folded and refolded. Fear, like tea, had steeped overnight and now ran bitter through the air. Poirot stood near the fireplace, observing his suspects not as criminals yet, but as players trapped in a game where the board had shifted under their feet. Lady Evelyn sat composed but distant, her hands clasped so tightly they blanched. Beatrice stared out the window, biting her lower lip in anxious silence. George Wexley pretended to read a newspaper, though he turned no pages. Lady Agatha whispered to Elise, who said nothing in return. Poirot cleared his throat gently and addressed them all with calm authority. Mesdames et messieurs, the murder of Sir Hugo Barrett was not a spontaneous act. It was orchestrated, deliberate, and above all, it was planned within the confines of this very estate. A silence followed, dense and breathless. The poison used, Poirot continued, was cyanide, and cyanide is not the choice of the impulsive. It is swift, yes, but it must be acquired, stored, and delivered with precision. Someone here plotted this. Someone among you had reason, opportunity, and knowledge. Lady Agatha snorted. You make it sound like a theater, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot smiled thinly. But madam, it is precisely that. And yesterday, the garden party was the first act. He turned to Elise. Mademoiselle, please walk me through the tea service once again, in exact order. Elise stood, straightened her apron, and spoke softly, her accent lilting. There were 6 cups on the tray, all white, except for the crimson teacup. Lady Evelyn told me to place that one before Sir Hugo. I did as she asked. The others were placed in front of Lady Agatha, George Wexley, Beatrice, Mr. Hawthorne, and Miss Eddington. Poirot interrupted. Miss Eddington? Evelyn replied. An actress, a friend of Beatrice's. She left late last night, with police permission. She's been ruled out. Had only just met Hugo. Poirot frowned. Even the innocent may observe what the guilty wish to hide. He noted the names and asked Elise, Did you leave the tray unattended at any moment? She hesitated. Only for a moment, just before entering the garden. I had to fetch a clean napkin from the pantry. Poirot raised an eyebrow. And where was the tray during that moment? On the marble counter. In the kitchen, she said. Anyone could have. She stopped herself, eyes wide. Poirot nodded slowly. Yes, anyone could have interfered. Later, that morning, Poirot visited the kitchen. It was immaculate, obsessively organized, a testament to Beatrice's cook, Mrs. Leake, who regarded chaos with open hostility. Poirot asked about the tea preparation, and Mrs. Leake confirmed the process. Earl Grey, all of it. Brewed fresh, steeped for 4 minutes exactly. No elderflower blend was made, monsieur. If someone added it, they did so after it left my hands. She looked offended at the implication. Poirot examined the teapots, sniffed the loose leaves, and nodded. Elderflower was foreign to the mix. Someone had doctored one cup, but not necessarily the crimson. Poirot recalled that Sir Hugo's cup had shattered, making analysis difficult. Still, traces on his lips and in his stomach had confirmed cyanide. That afternoon, Poirot called the guests individually for further questioning. First was George Wexley. His face remained stoic, but Poirot noticed the dampness at his collar. "You drafted Sir Hugo's final will, we?" Wexley nodded. "Barely a week ago. He made several changes." "Including what?" Poirot asked. Beatrice and Lady Evelyn were named major beneficiaries. He said Beatrice's gallery was a vision worth backing, and Lady Evelyn had provided guidance. The rest of his family were cut out completely. Poirot folded his hands. "So you delivered news that would delight some and enrage others. Did anyone protest?" Wexley hesitated. "Yes, Lady Agatha. She stormed out of the drawing room when she learned he wouldn't support her foundation anymore." Poirot nodded. "Interesting." Next came Lady Agatha. "Hugo was a brute," she declared. "But he was mine to deal with, not someone else's to kill. I'd have slapped him, yes. Poisoned him. Please." Poirot asked about her whereabouts just before tea was served. "I was in the powder room. Alone." Her tone dared him to challenge her. Then Beatrice entered, hands trembling, voice cracking. "Uncle Hugo, he believed in my work," she said. "He said he'd help me show the world that modern art wasn't madness. I would never harm him." Poirot asked her if she had access to elderflower. She blinked. "Yes. I use it sometimes in the herbal teas I drink. But I didn't add it to his cup." Poirot tilted his head. "So you had motive to want him alive. That's a rarity, mademoiselle." She looked down. "Unless someone wanted to frame me." By early evening, Poirot sat again in Lady Evelyn's study, a large notebook before him. He drew 6 small circles in a line, cups. 1 red, 5 white. "Let us consider," he muttered aloud, "that the crimson teacup, while symbolic, may have been a diversion. What if the poison was placed in another cup? What if the murderer assumed Sir Hugo would be served the red one, but altered the cups just before serving?" He returned to the tray. 6 identical placements, each cup able to be subtly shifted. Elise had left the tray unattended. That window, those few moments, was the only chance. Poirot imagined the scene. Someone enters, adds poison to 1 cup. Perhaps the crimson, perhaps not. But if the crimson was meant for Sir Hugo, any mistake in positioning would doom the wrong person. Poirot tapped the page. "Unless," he whispered, "unless the killer knew the tray would be left and ensured the poison was in whichever cup Sir Hugo would ultimately receive, regardless of its color." That suggested an inside knowledge of service order or control over the servant herself that he requested to speak with Elise once more. This time he was blunt. "Mademoiselle, were you instructed to do anything unusual with the tea?" "Anything at all." Elise looked frightened. "No, monsieur. Only well. Lady Evelyn gave me a separate note before the party." "A card." "Show me," Poirot said. Elise retrieved a folded card from her apron, embossed with Willowmere's crest. On it, in Lady Evelyn's hand, was written, "Place the crimson teacup in front of Sir Hugo. Do not deviate." Poirot frowned. A reinforcement or a subtle command to fix the outcome. "Did you think it strange?" "Yes, but I obeyed." Poirot stared at the note. "And did you tell anyone of this instruction?" "No, only now." Poirot smiled. "Thank you. That was most helpful." Night came quickly, the hall draped once more in heavy silence. Poirot walked the corridors, deep in thought. The killer was cunning. They had used tradition as a weapon, used expectation as camouflage, but they had made one critical error, assuming the crimson teacup would carry the blame. Poirot returned to the kitchen, opened the drawer where the spare porcelain was kept, and found something missing, a small spoon with a ruby set into its handle, matching the crimson set. Gone. Why would a spoon vanish, he wondered aloud. Unless it bore traces? The next morning, Poirot gathered all remaining guests in the library. "A spoon is missing," he said simply. The room tensed. Not just any spoon. One used with the crimson teacup set. Someone disposed of it. Why? Beatrice spoke first. Because it was used to stir the poison? Poirot nodded. Precisely. But who removed it and when? George Wexley cleared his throat. What if the killer returned after the party ended, cleaned up their tracks? "We," Poirot said. "And why did they not dispose of the cup as well?" No one answered. Poirot added, "Because the cup is a symbol. The killer hoped it would take the fall. But poison, like guilt, does not wash away so easily." The pieces were aligning now, slowly but surely. Elise had been controlled. The cups were vulnerable. Someone with knowledge of tradition and of Lady Evelyn's commands had exploited a moment of inattention. Poirot returned to his notebook, his circles, his timeline. He adjusted a few marks, then closed the cover. "Tomorrow," he said to himself, "we address the past. For only in the past can one truly know who has earned the motive for murder." Chapter 3. The echoes of yesterday, the morning after Hercule Poirot reconstructed the timeline of tea and murder, Willowmere Hall seemed to breathe differently. Its long corridors held the echoes of a house that had known luxury but never quite learned to speak of what it had buried. The weather outside had turned gloomy, low clouds drifting slowly across the sky as though mourning the secrets that were finally rising from the manicured earth, unwilling to remain rooted any longer. Poirot, rising precisely at 6, bathed, shaved, and selected a soft gray three-piece suit, ironed and folded with the exactitude only a Belgian mind could appreciate. He descended the wide staircase not to dine or to socialize, but to pry open the chest of memories that had been nailed shut for decades and hidden beneath antique carpets and oil paintings. The world of aristocracy, he mused, never destroyed its evidence, it simply archived it. And so, Poirot began his day in the grand library of Willowmere, a cavernous chamber of mahogany shelves, hunting trophies, and ancient ledgers bound in cracked leather. He wasn't just looking for records. He was looking for motives encrypted by etiquette, names encoded through hospitality, and scandals buried under years of estate preservation. Willowmere, like all old English homes, was a monument to public decorum and private dysfunction, and Poirot believed the current crime was a shadow cast by older sins. In the estate's guest registries and event logs, he found the name Sir Hugo Barrett repeated over the span of 25 years, always close to family gatherings, always appearing not long after Lord Charles Marchwood returned from overseas business. There were receipts, too, transfers of large sums to unnamed entities, marked only by initials, and a cryptic note from Lord Charles's personal bookkeeper that read, "H.B. repaid without honor." Poirot made a mental note of the year, 1917, just before the war ended. Just before everything would begin unraveling for the Marchwoods, he found Lady Evelyn in the portrait corridor, staring up at her late husband's painting. The image of Lord Charles Marchwood stood 11 feet tall, posed in full dress uniform, a saber at his side, and an expression like carved ice. Beneath it hung an entirely different portrait, that of Beatrice, done in the modernist style, bold, chaotic, and slightly unnerving. The two portraits were philosophical opposites, and Poirot saw something poetic in their arrangement. Lady Evelyn greeted him without turning her head. "You found something," she said, more as an accusation than an observation. "I found context," Poirot replied. "And context is the frame that surrounds every crime. Without it, we see only chaos. But when we place the crime in its true frame, order emerges." Evelyn turned to him slowly, her face calm but pale. "You know about Portsmouth," she said flatly. "I do," he replied. "The failed development, the money lost, and the maid who died during a drunken night no one wanted to remember." Her eyes flashed, but she nodded. "It was Charles. He had too much to drink. He pushed her, She fell. She died. Hugo saw it. And instead of reporting it, he said he'd keep quiet. For a price. Poirot stepped closer. And the price kept rising, didn't it? She nodded again. Year after year. He said he was protecting our name. But it wasn't protection, it was possession. He owned our silence. Poirot studied her. And now that he's dead, madam, you are free. But freedom bought through death comes with suspicion. Evelyn clenched her gloved hands. I didn't kill him, Monsieur Poirot. I would have sooner burned this estate to the ground then. Let it be stained by another scandal. That man, he poisoned our lives long before he sipped from any cup. Poirot thanked her and went to speak with Beatrice, who was in the conservatory again, surrounded by canvases that seemed to bleed emotion. She was painting with wild strokes, colors clashing, the scent of turpentine thick in the air. Poirot stood silently for a moment, observing the canvas, a storm of reds, blacks, and golds, a violent image of something breaking. Is it pain or confession? He asked gently. She stopped, startled. It's fear, she said. The kind that takes years to find a voice. Poirot sat beside her. Tell me about your uncle, he said. About Sir Hugo. Her jaw tightened. He was charming, once. Until he knew you depended on him. Then he changed. I thought I could escape his hold by starting my gallery. He offered to fund it. I refused. He insisted. I said I didn't need him. He said I'd come crawling back. I told him I'd rather paint in the streets than owe him another pound. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Did you threaten him? She hesitated. I told him I'd expose his past. I didn't know all the details, but I knew he wasn't innocent. He laughed, said no one would believe a girl who painted faces with purple noses. Poirot didn't smile. And yet, your conviction may have frightened him. Enough that he made new enemies. Or revived old ones. Beatrice looked down. I didn't kill him, monsieur. I hated him. But hate isn't always enough. Poirot nodded. No, but fear sometimes is. He spent the afternoon reconstructing the movement of every guest and servant between the hours of 3 and 5. He created a visual timeline, 6 cups on a tray, 1 crimson, 5 white, 6 guests, 1 dead. He traced Elise's path, the route from the kitchen to the garden, her brief moment of absence to retrieve a napkin. In that moment, anyone could have altered the tray. Poirot marked each person's alibi. Wexley had gone to his room to fetch cufflinks. Lady Agatha had gone to the powder room. Beatrice had been sketching by the hedge. Evelyn had gone to the kitchen to check on the cakes, according to Elise. All of them had access. All of them had motive. But there was more. Poirot suspected the real murder weapon was not the cup, but the assumption surrounding it. Everyone believed the crimson teacup was symbolic. Therefore, anyone who could ensure Sir Hugo got that cup would only need to poison that one. But what if someone switched the order last minute? Or planted more than one poison cup? That night, Poirot requested the entire party return to the garden for a reenactment. The waitstaff carried identical trays with cups. Everyone was told to sit exactly as they had the day before. Elise stood trembling with the tray in hand, moving towards Sir Hugo's former seat. As she neared the place where he once sat, her hand shook violently. Poirot stepped forward. Stop, he said calmly. You are not remembering. You are reliving. Elise broke down. I didn't want to get it wrong. Someone told me to serve the crimson teacup to Sir Hugo and warned me not to disobey. Poirot asked quietly, Who warned you? She whispered, Lady Agatha. The name fell like a thunderclap. Poirot ended the reenactment and escorted Lady Agatha to the study. You interfered with the servant, he said plainly. You instructed her to serve the crimson teacup. What? Agatha, indignant, snapped. Because Evelyn asked me to. She said it was tradition. I merely reinforced it. Poirot narrowed his gaze. But why reinforce something already known? Agatha faltered. I thought Elise needed a reminder. Poirot moved closer. Or you wanted to ensure the poison went to the right man. She flushed. How dare you, because You were the only one who stood to lose everything if Hugo changed his will again. Your foundation, your reputation, your very place in this world. Agatha slumped into a chair. He promised me security. Then he took it back. Said I was old and tiresome. Said Beatrice was the future of art, and I was a relic of guilt. Poirot was silent. But I didn't kill him, she whispered. I wanted to, God help me, but I didn't. That night, Poirot sat alone with the crimson teacup. He examined it under lamplight, tracing every curve, and finally noticed something he had missed. A smudge beneath the handle. Faint, oily, unnatural. Not tea, not sugar. He used a cloth to lift the residue and tucked it into an envelope. Then, he returned to the silver drawer. The spoon with the ruby handle was still missing. Poirot sighed. The smallest things, he whispered, are often the loudest clues. He returned to his room, and from his coat removed a folded paper he had found earlier in George Wexley's belongings. A draft of a legal amendment, and signed but with language clearly indicating that Sir Hugo had reconsidered all inheritances. Poirot now had the final pieces. A motive made of legacy, a murder built on tradition, and a killer hiding not in shadows, but in plain sight, beneath porcelain and pretense. Chapter 4. A sip of silence. The day of reckoning arrived cloaked in gray. As though nature itself had taken on the pallor of the household's unease, the thick air inside Willowmere Hall turning heavier with each passing hour as the once grand estate now bristled with the weight of accusation and anticipation, like an actor frozen on stage waiting for the final curtain to fall. Hercule Poirot, ever composed, ever deliberate, had spent the morning deep in reflection, not simply aligning facts, but rearranging them like chess pieces until the pattern emerged not just logically, but with motive, means, and, most critically, intent. Intent, he knew, was what separated accidental death from murder, and behind Sir Hugo Barrett's abrupt collapse during the garden party lay not merely chance or misfortune, but orchestration, a plan executed beneath layers of social pleasantries, family tensions, and old, unspoken debts. He had gathered everyone in the drawing room not for comfort, not even for confrontation, but for revelation, for this was the stage upon which truths would be peeled back with surgical precision, and where the mask worn by the murderer would be finally and irrefutably torn away. The guests arrived in silence, their postures tense, voices absent, as if collectively aware that the charade was over, that the days of polite avoidance were behind them now, and only the blade of Poirot's logic remained. Lady Evelyn entered last, her black dress more ceremonial than mournful, trailed by Beatrice, whose eyes had grown darker since the day of the murder, followed by George Wexley, clutching a folder of legal notes that no longer had any power to protect him, then Lady Agatha, expression tight, and finally Elise, standing by the door like a servant in a firing squad lineup, pale and already trembling under the weight of her knowledge. Poirot stood by the tall French doors overlooking the estate's gardens, hands clasped behind his back, not needing height or volume to command the room. His presence alone had become the axis around which every secret now revolved. My friends, he began, softly but with authority. You have waited, some patiently, some fearfully, for the truth to emerge. And now, as every thread has led to its conclusion, I must tell you what really happened. Who killed Sir Hugo Barrett, and more importantly, why? The silence in the room deepened, growing almost physical. We begin not with the tea, Poirot said, but with the history. Because murder does not begin with the weapon, it begins with the wound. He gestured toward the family portrait above the mantel. Sir Hugo Barrett was no stranger to this house. He was not simply a benefactor or a guest. He was a man who owned pieces of the Marshwood past, pieces that were shameful, dangerous, and best left forgotten. He saw, years ago, something he was not meant to see. A young maid dead at the foot of a staircase, her fall caused not by accident, but by the drunken rage of Lord Charles Marshwood. The room recoiled collectively. The war was ending. Silence was bought, not earned. And Sir Hugo, kept the secret. But he did not keep it quietly. He used it. And with each year, his leverage grew. His demands evolved from hush money to power, from power to possession. Lady Evelyn and her family became, in effect, his hostages. Evelyn closed her eyes. "He would never let us go," she whispered. Poirot continued, "But there is something deeper. Because blackmail is not motive enough for murder, not on its own. There had to be something more. And there was." He turned toward George Wexley. "Monsieur Wexley, you served as both solicitor and confidant to Sir Hugo for over 2 decades. You drafted wills, concealed transfers, and rewrote legacies. But, recently, you were informed that Sir Hugo planned to amend his will again, yes?" George said nothing. Poirot stepped closer. "You were to be removed. Your role diminished. Your access cut. You had tolerated his arrogance for years, allowed your name to be tethered to his lies. And when he threatened to take everything, you acted." Beatrice turned sharply toward George, confusion and realization battling in her expression. "You," she said, voice cracking. Poirot raised a hand gently. "Allow me to finish. The plan was not improvised. It was brilliant in its simplicity, theatrical in its misdirection. It used the very tradition of this house, the crimson teacup, as camouflage. Everyone believed, without question, that Sir Hugo would receive the red cup. Elise, the maid, was instructed repeatedly. But what no one expected, what no one questioned, was the possibility that the crimson teacup might not have been the poison one at all. He turned to Elise. "You were frightened, oui?" Pressured by more than one person to ensure the cup was served as tradition demanded. She nodded shakily. "I didn't know what was happening. I thought if I got it wrong, someone would be angry. I didn't know it would." Her voice trailed off into silence. Poirot stepped forward again. "But the truth is, the poison cup was not crimson. It was white. A switch was made in the kitchen, subtle, efficient. One white teacup, indistinguishable from the others, except for a trace of elderflower and bitter almond. The former to mask the scent, the latter to kill." Lady Agatha gasped. "But why white?" Poirot met her eyes. "Because everyone was watching the crimson teacup. It was tradition. It was theater. So long as the red cup was in sight, no one suspected the others. The killer used expectation as a shield." He turned to George Wexley. "And that is why, when I examined the fingerprints on the remaining cups and tray, only one person's prints appeared where they should not have. On a second cup, the poison one. The same person who was seen, briefly, in the kitchen hallway. The same person whose financial future depended on Sir Hugo's silence and generosity. The same man who had the legal skill to know how long it would take for the new will to be processed. Enough time for his name to remain on the old one." George finally spoke, his voice hollow. "He said he'd ruin me. After all these years, he was going to take it all back. Like I was a dog he'd grown bored of." Poirot's tone grew sharp. "And so, you decided to kill. To switch the cups, poison one, and make sure it reached his lips. But you feared that perhaps the wrong cup would be blamed. So you made another mistake. You touched the ruby-handled spoon, used only for the crimson teacup, and when you realized you'd left it behind, you returned later and removed it. But your absence was noted. The drawer was disturbed, and the missing spoon, while never found, left behind a space that told us everything we needed." Poirot walked away, letting the weight of the truth settle over them all like ash. "You see, murder is never committed in isolation. It is the final breath of a dying secret, gasping to preserve itself. But the truth, like steam, always rises." George slumped into the armchair, expression vacant, as the sound of approaching boots echoed down the hallway. The constable had arrived, summoned by Poirot hours ago, prepared for the arrest the moment this moment reached its crescendo. No one moved. Lady Evelyn sat frozen, one hand to her mouth. Beatrice turned away, as if unable to bear the sight. Elise wept quietly. Lady Agatha whispered something only she could hear. Poirot did not gloat. He did not revel. He simply watched, solemn and precise, as the murderer was taken away, neatly, silently, as if the estate had finally exhaled the poison it had carried for too long. Only once George was gone did Poirot speak again. "And now," he said softly, "you are free. Not because the killer is gone, but because the truth, at last, is known." The room remained silent for a long moment. Outside, the wind changed direction. Chapter 5. The Final Pour. The rain began just before dawn. Thin, persistent, and cold. Not the violent kind that demands attention, but the quiet kind that soaks in slowly, as if to cleanse the estate one stone at a time. Willowmere Hall, once proud and stoic in its rituals, now stood like a mausoleum of fading legacies. Every corner whispering of secrets finally unearthed and truths no longer willing to stay buried. Inside, the silence was not peaceful, it was stunned. The kind of silence that follows a great reveal in a theater, when the curtains fall and the audience remains still, absorbing what they've just witnessed. Hercule Poirot rose before the house stirred, meticulously dressed, as always, his pocket square aligned with millimetric precision, the weight of closure sitting not on his shoulders, but somewhere deeper, in that place where even the most brilliant detective feels the fatigue of human folly. The events of the previous day had unraveled with the inevitability of fate. George Wexley arrested, his motivations exposed like the frayed pages of a once sealed journal, and the illusion of the crimson teacup ceremony forever shattered. The morning hours were spent in quiet conversation, one by one, with the wounded who remained. Lady Evelyn, once composed by obligation and repression, now sat near the hearth with none of her usual grandeur, her face no longer powdered into poise but left natural, almost transparent, as if confession had thinned her into someone closer to real. Poirot joined her without announcement. She looked at him with tired dignity and asked, "When does the healing begin, Monsieur Poirot?" He answered gently, "It begins when the silence no longer feels safer than the truth. And for that, madam, it has already begun." She breathed, barely audible, as though her lungs had forgotten how to hold clean air after decades of secrets. "My husband never paid for what he did. But the debt found its way here anyway, didn't it?" Poirot nodded. "Murder is not always the original sin, madam. Sometimes it is merely the final ripple from the first stone thrown into still waters." And in that moment, she looked away, not with guilt, but with understanding. Later, in the conservatory, Poirot found Beatrice not painting, but simply standing, rigid, haunted, beside a dry canvas, her hands clean for the first time in days. She did not greet him. She only asked, "Will I ever paint something that isn't soaked in memory?" Poirot responded, "Memory is not poison, mademoiselle. It is pigment. You decide the canvas it belongs to." She turned to him with wet eyes. "I thought I had broken free of him, but I let him live in every choice I made. Even my anger still fed him." Poirot spoke softly. "Then paint something that denies him space. Not revenge, redemption. Not power, peace. You do not owe him even your fury." She nodded slowly, as if granting herself permission for the first time. "Then I will." He smiled faintly. "Good. And when you do not forget that color can heal, even red." As he turned to leave, she handed him a sketch, one drawn quickly but with unmistakable precision, his profile, captured in the moment. He stood before the fire the previous night, face illuminated by justice and shadowed by restraint. He accepted it with reverence and tucked it into his coat pocket. "A parting gift," she said. "Or perhaps a reminder that not all men who wear suits carry burdens. They also carry answers." By late afternoon, The rain eased to a mist. Poirot walked alone in the garden, retracing the exact steps that had led to the fatal tea. 6 seats, 1 tray, 5 white cups, and the infamous crimson. Only now, there was no tray, no gathering, no pressure, just wind and memory. Elise approached him, cautious but no longer hiding behind role or rank. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, voice steadier than before. "I've never been more frightened than I was that day." He turned to her with kindness in his eyes. "And yet, mademoiselle, you were brave. Fear is not cowardice. Silence, when truth is known, is." She hesitated. "I wish I had spoken earlier." Poirot looked into the distance. The truth arrived when it was needed. That is all we can ask of ourselves. Elise looked down at her apron, hands tightening. "What happens now?" He answered, "Now, Willowmere will change, not in one day, but it will. The shadows are not gone, but they are thinner now." And then she surprised him. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the investigation, not for the answers, but for listening." Poirot nodded once and walked away to as the sky turned gold behind low clouds. Poirot's car arrived at the front of the estate. His suitcase, packed with folded memories, waited in the back seat. Lady Evelyn, Beatrice, Elise, and even Lady Agatha, standing tall but cracked, gathered to see him off. There were no long speeches, no apologies, just the air of lives quietly rearranged by truth. Evelyn stepped forward. "You were not what I expected, Monsieur Poirot." He raised a brow. "And what did you expect, madam?" She smiled faintly. "A detective, not a mirror." He tipped his hat. "Even mirrors crack, madam, but they still reflect." Beatrice hugged him, a soft, spontaneous gesture that caught them both off guard, and whispered, "Promise me something." He paused. "We don't stop unmasking the people who hide behind teacups." He smiled. "That, mademoiselle, is a promise I can keep." The car pulled away from Willowmere Hall as the fog crept in once more, curling around the iron gates and sweeping the estate into its quiet, humbled future. Inside his coat pocket, the sketch she'd drawn pressed against his heart, not as evidence, but as a reminder that sometimes justice is not about punishment. It is about closure, and so, the mystery of the Crimson Teacup reached its final page, not with shouts or dramatic last words, but with the soft and irreversible shift of truth settling into the bones of a place once defined by concealment. Sir Hugo Barrett was dead, but in truth, he had died long before his final sip. What the poison ended was not merely a man, but an era, a chain of silences, a kingdom ruled by fear disguised as favor. And in the wake of that death, new stories would begin. One's no longer controlled by whispered threats or tarnished legacies. Poirot, as ever, did not linger. His role was never to stay, only to reveal, to set the gears of justice in motion, and to ensure that when the smoke cleared, those who remained could finally breathe without wondering which secret might suffocate them next if this tale stirred something in you. If you found yourself gripped by the tension, drawn into the layers of deception, and satisfied by the justice served not only by handcuffs but by confession, then you are exactly where you belong. Subscribe now to Haunting Veils and step into a world of carefully unraveled mysteries, psychological intrigue, and characters who remind us that truth hides in the smallest things: a glance, a gesture, or a crimson cup. Like this video if you enjoyed watching Hercule Poirot at work. Share it with fellow mystery lovers who crave stories that make them think, feel, and reflect. And always remember, the most dangerous poisons in life are not those we sip, but those we refuse to name.